welcome to this I believe this is the 5th session according to the internet. I'm calling this session 3 part 1 because it's replicating what I would do on the 3rd evening of the live courses. And in this particular session we are going to finish off talking about the external environment. That's going to be chapter 4, and we are also going to be looking at the internal environment, in other words, chapter 5. So the competitive environment, chapter 4, internal analysis, chapter 5, and then we will have a look at a question, June 2013, question 1, machine shop, which you can download from the ACCA's website. It's not in the revision kit. The last one, the ham and choose one, was. This one isn't. So that is basically the plan for this session, which again will be split into 2 sections. So part 1, chapter 4 and start chapter 5. Part 2, finish chapter 5 and have a look at the question. So that's basically the plan for what we are going to be doing. There we go. So chapter 4. You may remember from the previous session that we were looking at the environment. We were particularly interested in the changing environment. We were particularly interested in looking at what is going on in the outside world which affects us. Now, what we looked at then in chapter 3 was we looked at the macro environment. The macro environment, things which affect an entire industry. All accountancy colleges that do ACCA are affected in the same way by this. They're affected by that. Not only that, there is often very little that they can do about it. So there's little that they can do about the changes. Now, by that, what I mean is, if the economy is getting worse, there's nothing LSPF can do about it. If the government decides to change law, there's nothing the LSPF can do about it. So we have very little control over things in the macro environment. Now, what we're going to have in chapter 4 is a little bit different. So the macro environment affects the entire industry, and we have virtually no control over it. A new technology comes along, there's nothing we can do about it. The big model, if you remember, was PESTLE. And when we're looking at PESTLE, we are looking at political, economic, social, technological, environmental and legal. And the idea is simply those 6 headings simply give us 6 categories to say, you told me that fits under economic, this is how it affects the company. You told me this, it fits under legal, this is how it affects the company. It just gives you 6 headings, that's all. Now, chapter 4 is about the competitive environment, and it's also about the industry environment, and it's also about the market environment, because the examiner isn't consistent. So my advice to you, if he says macro, it is PESTLE. If he says anything else, and then the word environment, chapter 4, and the model we're going to use, Porter's 5 forces. So the big model that we're going to have in this chapter is Porter's 5 forces. Now, we've got a couple of pages before we get to Porter's 5 forces, but the big thing is that all the pages leading up to it are all to do with Porter's 5 forces, because students get Porter's 5 forces wrong all the time in the exam. They look at the wrong things. So we're going to make sure we're very clear exactly what we're doing when we're looking at Porter's 5 forces. And of course, the first thing that I should say to all of you, how many forces are there in Porter's 5 forces? The answer is not 5. So that's one of the mistakes that students make. We'll talk about how many it is later, but it isn't 5. So We'll talk about industries and strategic groups and the life cycle, all of which will affect what we need with Porter's Five Forces. Ignore these page numbers. It's simply because I have cut just chapter 4 and 5 out of the main notes and it's renumbered everything, so ignore that. Let's have a look at some past exam requirements. The way that the examiner often uses Porter's Five Forces is in exactly the same way it's done in both of these questions. Use Porter's Five Forces to assess the attractiveness of entering a particular industry. Now, you may remember strategic choices is all about thinking about what we should do next. So you analyse something, then you make your choice. What are you asked to do in June 2013? Analyse what's going on at the moment in this industry, the discount fixed price retail market, and then make a choice. Is it a market we want to go into? December 2009. Use Porter's framework, analyse the business analysis certification industry, and assess whether it's an attractive market for ABCL to enter. I would argue, and I hope you'd agree, that those are the same question. Different answers, because they're different situations, but they're the same question. Now, what is he asking you to do? He's saying, use Porter's Five Forces, put things under each of the headings, which you will find in the case study, and then, once you have done that, you'll have to say, well, that's going to make it easy to enter, that's going to make it hard to enter, that's going to mean we're not going to make any money, that's going to mean we might make some money, and what are you going to have to do at the end? You need to say, yes, it is attractive, or no, it is unattractive. Hardly any students in June 2013 or in December 2009 did that. Hardly any students said, you know what, that's a good industry for you to go into. Or that's a bad industry. They just had no opinion whatsoever. You may remember me saying to you in the very first session, one of the things you are expected to do is to exercise your professional judgment. You have to say, yes, do it because, or no, do not do it because. There will be 2 or 3 marks for that, whatever your opinion is. As long as you've got a sensible because, you'll get 2 or 3 marks. Most students get 0 for that bit. They simply say, I have done Porter's Five Forces, and now I'm going to go on and do something else. Again, you may remember from the first session, I said to you, imagine you've got a client, and your client has written to you, and they're saying, do you think we should do this? And your answer doesn't actually answer that. I've done Porter's Five Forces, where's my money? You need to pay me for giving you some advice. You haven't given them any advice. You haven't said whether it's good or not. So always, always, always have an opinion on it. Doesn't matter what the opinion is, just have an opinion of some kind. Porter's Five Forces could also be used alongside PESTLE. I don't know whether you remember in one of the questions that was at the start of chapter 3, it said look at the macro and the industry analysis, do that for EcoCar. So in EcoCar, there was a bit of PESTLE, there was a bit of Porter's Five Forces. So it's a very common thing to get on the exam. The great thing about Porter's Five Forces, like PESTLE, is it's simply some headings. That is all that it is. So all you've got to do in the exam is say, you told me this, it goes under that heading, and this is why it matters. That's it. Right, the reason why we've got a few pages before we get to Porter's Five Forces is because lots of students get confused about what Porter's Five Forces actually is about. Porter's Five Forces is basically about competition. So we need to be very clear that we know who the competition is. That's the key thing. Lots of students get it wrong. They will say things like, there is a lot of competition from this kind of company, and they're not actually rivals at all. They're doing something different. They're nothing to do with us. They don't do the same kind of things. So you need to be, so if, let's say, for example, you were thinking about there is a lot of competition within companies that publish books to do with accountancy. That may well be true. What's that got to do with LSBF? That isn't what we do. They're not rivals. They're not our competitors because they don't do the same thing. And in the exam, students will say, oh, accountancy training, accountancy books, it's the same industry. No, it isn't. So they're not rivals for us. So we need to be very careful with that. So the first thing we're going to talk about is industries and sectors. An industry is a group of firms. The accountancy training industry in the UK, BPP, Kaplan, LSBF, there are some others, a company called First Intuition, other ones whose name escapes me at the moment, I can't remember at the moment, not that it particularly matters, but we are basically, within that industry, there is obviously going to be some kind of rivalry because we're all selling products to students. Now, in some industries, there is another kind of rival. And the other kind of rival is a public sector organisation who don't exist to make a profit, but still take your potential customers. And that's called a sector. Now, in the UK, accountancy training is not an industry. Accountancy training is a sector. Because in addition to BPP, Kaplan, us, etc., there are universities that train people to do ACCA. Now, they're not there as profit-making organisations, but every time a student goes to one of those universities, they don't come to us. So that's, in effect, that is a competitor for us. Even though they're not there to make any money, every time they go there, they don't come to us. It's a lost sale to us. If I was setting up, and again, I don't know where you are, so this example might not work where you are, but if I was setting up a dental practice, I was going to be a dentist in the UK, who are my rivals? Well, other private dentists. And yet that's probably not, if you're in the UK, that's not the first thing you would have thought of. The first thing you would have thought of if you're in the UK would be the National Health Service. Because every time a patient goes to the National Health Service, which is not a company, doesn't exist to make money, every time a patient goes to the National Health Service, they don't come to my dental practice. So I could lose sales to other dentists, I could lose sales to the NHS. As far as I'm concerned, the NHS is a competitor. It's taking potential customers from me, even though they're not a company. Now, just be careful about that in the exam, because sometimes the biggest competitor is not even another company. So, industries, sectors. Strategic groups. Now, again, this is important because in the exam, you may get groups of companies that actually aren't really rivals to you. I'll just do an example. It's not a particularly brilliant example, but let's do an example. So, number of students, profits. Here are various colleges in London doing ACCA. Right, so we've got BPP, we've got Kaplan, we've got LSBF. I'll put LSBF down there. LSBF is a bit smaller, so that's BPP. Actually, that's Kaplan, that's BPP, and that's LSBF. We are a little bit smaller than the other two. We don't have quite as many students. We don't make quite as much money because we don't have quite as many students. But we're pretty much the same size. Now, we are what's called a strategic group. We are all fairly similar in size. There is a lot of rivalry inside that group. We want to be better than BPP. BPP want to be better than Kaplan. Kaplan want to be better than us. There's a lot of rivalry there. There's a lot of very small colleges in London that do ACCA that may only have, I don't know, 100, 150 students. They may have even less than that. Now, there will be a lot of rivalry inside that group as well, because a lot of them are probably only just surviving. And every student that, I'll colour that in, every student that the college I'm colouring in green loses to the college I'm colouring in yellow, it might take them closer to being bankrupt. So there's a lot of rivalry inside that circle. There's virtually no rivalry between the circles. We don't really care what the small companies do. Doesn't affect us. They don't really care what we do because they can't do anything about us anyway. So the idea is that you've got two different groups, and within the group, there's a lot of rivalry. Between the groups, there isn't. I don't know whether it's a better example or a worse example. It won't make any difference at all. I'm not a football fan. Football doesn't interest me in the slightest. But I know about the English Premier League, and the English Premier League is one of the biggest football leagues in terms of viewership in the world. Now, I think there are three groups of teams that are in the English Premier League. There's the teams at the top, Chelsea, Manchester City, Manchester United, Arsenal, maybe Liverpool, and there is a lot of rivalry between those five because one of those five is usually going to win the league. I would struggle to tell you the last time it was a team that was not one of those five. There probably was one, but I don't know when it was. That was not one of those big five. So there's a lot of rivalry inside that group. And often who wins the league is determined by who wins the matches between those five people. Now, at the other end, there's going to be a group of teams who aren't particularly good, who are a lot smaller, and there's a lot of rivalry between those teams. I can't even tell you who they are, I'm afraid, because I don't know. There's a lot of rivalry between those teams because who gets relegated out of the Premier League probably depends on the results between those teams. The big teams and the little teams, there isn't a lot of rivalry between them. The big teams almost always beat the little teams. So there's a lot of rivalry, the big teams. There's a lot of rivalry, the little teams. There's not a lot of rivalry between them. Who comes top of the Premier League is not decided really by how many times the big teams beat the little teams, because it happens all the time. It's decided how many times the big teams beat each other. And who gets relegated is the matches between the little teams. So there's a lot of rivalry inside the group. There's very little rivalry between the groups. Now be careful of that in the exam, because we have had questions in the exam with different groups and students saying a little company down here, that one down there in blue, is a rival for that big one up there. No, they're not. They're not rivals at all. They're in different groups. The big company may not even know the little company exists. So just be careful about that, strategic groups. Now, I don't know who you work for, but if I was to come and visit you and to say, who are your rivals? You would almost certainly pick somebody that's in the same group, that's roughly the same size as you. You wouldn't pick somebody that's a lot bigger or a lot smaller. So you actually use strategic groups at work. You just probably haven't ever thought about it. So strategic groups are important because we're talking about who is the competition. The life cycle. Now in the life cycle, step back a bit. The life cycle, again, you've probably seen in other papers. Life cycle goes like that. We have the introduction stage, growth stage, maturity stage, and decline stage. And all industries go through these stages. What this means is a new industry appears. The TV industry didn't exist back in the 1920s. It appeared. And I think the BBC, and I may well be wrong, I think the BBC was the first television service in the world, but I may well be wrong. And then obviously it grew very quickly during the 50s and 60s and 70s. It's probably now mature, as in, there's not an awful lot of new people who are suddenly able to watch the TV that have never been able to do it before, and at some point it will go into decline. Now, a good example of an industry that is in decline is radio. Radio was introduced back in the 1890s, grew throughout the 20s and 30s, probably peaked around about 1950, and is in decline and has been for the last 50 years. But there are still people listening to radio, but not as many as there used to be. So industries will come and industries will go. The key thing from the point of view of Porter's five forces is that when we are in the growth stage, there will be a particular kind of competitor we need to worry about. And we will need to worry about new people, new companies who are coming into the industry. Why will we need to worry? Because the industry is growing. And if the industry is growing, people will see that there is money to be made. And they will think, we need to give our shareholders returns, we need dividends, we need profits. Here is a new industry where there's money to be made. Let's go into that industry. Now, on the other hand, if you're over here in the decline stage, there are not that many companies that are going to say, you know what, let's go into that industry. That industry is falling away. There's less and less and less customers. Not many people are going to say, let's go into that industry. But there will still be rivalry, but it will be from companies that are already there and haven't yet left. So, one of the things that has been noticeable, I have said in a previous lecture to you that I've worked as a lecturer since 1997, and I became a lecturer when the ACCA was probably, I would say, around about there. The ACCA had been around for a long time, but it suddenly grew really, really quickly in the late 1990s and the early part of the 21st century. And lots and lots and lots of new companies came into the industry. I think it's probably matured now. I don't think it's declining, but it's probably maturing. You're not going to have an awful lot of new companies coming in, but what you will have is the companies that are already here. LSBF was a new entrant. LSBF didn't teach ACCA until about 2007. So LSBF has only done ACCA for a few years. So we were a new entrant. We probably entered when the industry was about there, I would think. But I can't see more people coming into it. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. Now, although it's not relevant to Chapter 4, something that is relevant for what we've seen already, what happens if the industry is in decline? What should you do? You should think about leaving that industry because you're not going to make any money in it, and you should enter a new industry. Well, what kind of industry should you enter? One that's growing. And so what a company ought to do is you ought to have this sort of cycle where you're in an industry which is in decline, so you go into a new one, and you go through that, and it grows, and it matures, and it declines, and you leave that, and you go into a new one, and it grows, and it matures, and you're constantly going into industries which are growing or mature. Now, you may remember what that's called from the very first session, from Chapter 1, moving into new industries, leaving other industries. That was called corporate. That was called corporate strategy. And so the idea behind corporate strategy then is doing exactly what we're saying here. Leave some industries, move into a new one where there's more money to be made. Now, as I say, the key thing with Porter's Five Forces is that there is always going to be some kind of rivalry, but it's going to be a different kind of rivalry depending on where you are. Right, now that leads us to Porter's Five Forces. Now again, I've got some notes in here about what to look for. Please, please, please do not worry. I'm really not worried about all that stuff. You don't need to learn it. What you need to do in the exam is to recognise that the examiner has told you something which is going to make a difference to the company, and it's to do with, not anything to do with political, economic or social or any of that pestle stuff. It's to do with rivals, it's to do with customers, it's to do with suppliers. But you still do exactly the same thing. This is what you told me, this is the difference it's going to make, and it's going to mean revenue goes down. This is what you told me, this is what this means costs are going to go up, or whatever it happens to be. Yeah, so the key thing is, how does it affect the company? Now, one of the big differences between PESTLE and Porter's Five Forces is that in PESTLE, some things were bad. The government's going to change the law. But some things were good. In Porter's Five Forces, they're all bad. Everything here in Porter's Five Forces is a threat. The question is, how severe. How big is the threat? They're all threats, but some of them are bigger, are more important than others. That's the key bit with Porter's five forces. Right, so, new competition. There is a threat that a new company will enter into our industry. So there's a threat that a new college will come along and it will enter into the ACCA market. Now, what would happen? You would have the number of customers would go down because the new company will take some of your customers. And what almost always happens is that the prices will go down because the new college will charge cheaper prices to try and attract students. Now, I hope you can all see, of course you can all see, that means those two, singly or together, mean the revenue is going to go down. So if you only had fewer customers, you'd have less revenue. If you had the same number of customers but your prices go down, you'll have less revenue. If both of those happen, you have less revenue. Or the other thing that will happen is that your costs will go up. You will have to do more advertising in order to try and attract these students back again. Or you'll have to spend more money on better facilities to try and keep the customers you've already got. But it's going to cost you money. Now, one of those three, or two of them, or even all three of them, always happens when there is a new entrant, when there is a new competitor into the industry. And what's going to happen? Profit will go down. So what Porter cares about is how likely is that? Now, you may have come across something called a barrier to entry. A barrier to entry is what keeps rivals out. If the barriers to entry are low, it means it's easy for anybody to set up a company in that industry. That is a big threat. There's a big, big chance that somebody will set up a company in the industry because it's easy to do. On the other hand, if barriers to entry are very high, it's very difficult for somebody to do this. Now, let's imagine that I wanted to start my own accountancy college. Don't know why I'd do that, but let's say I did. Barriers to entry are very low. It's actually very easy to do. You need a building, you need some lecturers. That's it. So all the companies, LSBF, Kaplan, BPP, all the other ones, always constantly need to worry there is a threat from new competition because it's easy to get into the industry. What about if I wanted to set up a radio station? In the UK, you need a licence to run a radio station. So I don't have a licence. It would be very difficult for me to set up a radio station in the UK. So the barriers to entry there are very high. That means if you are a company that has a radio station, you don't really need to worry very much about new competition because it isn't going to happen. So there is always a threat from new competition. Porter says, is it a big threat or is it a small threat? If it happens, it's bad for profits. Revenue goes down, costs go up. Competitors that are existing. In other words, companies that are already your rivals. Now, this is where this matches up with the strategic groups bit. Remember, LSBF, our rivals are BPP and Kaplan, not the smaller colleges. So, what happens if there's a lot of rivalry? Obviously, BPP are trying to take our customers. We're trying to take Kaplan's customers. Kaplan's trying to take BPP's customers. So, customer numbers could go down. Prices may well be forced down for the same reason. They'll try and get customers by charging lower prices. Costs will go up because everybody's trying to get the best lecturers to try and get the customers to come to them, get students to come to them. So if there is a lot of rivalry from existing competitors, you also won't make much money. Now remember what the examiner said. He said, use Porter's five forces to say, is it an attractive industry? If revenues are going to go down, if costs are going to go up, so profits will be falling, it's not a particularly attractive industry. So we will need to say, look, there's a big chance that this is going to happen, or there's only a small chance it's going to happen. Now again, if you're in a growing industry, big threat from new entrants, because lots of companies will want to get in. If you're in a declining industry, not much threat from new entrants at all. In the declining industry, your threat will be from existing rivals. So you'll need to look at the question to see what kind of rivalry there is likely to be. Customers. Now, customers, this links back to what we said about Mendelot in a previous lecture. You may remember that Mendelot said, are the customers powerful? Sorry, Mendelot didn't say that at all. Sorry. Mendelot said, are the stakeholders powerful? I do apologise. Mendelot said, are the stakeholders powerful? Customers can be powerful. What would make a powerful customer? Somebody that you rely on. If 90% of your sales revenue goes to one customer, then that customer is very powerful, because obviously they could just leave. They could go somewhere else. Now, powerful customers, what do? They get what they want. We have to keep them happy. What do customers want? Customers want low prices. So if you've got powerful customers, prices will be forced down. Won't make any difference to cost, or probably won't make any difference to cost, won't make any difference to the number of customers you have, but prices will be forced down, which means less revenue for you, which means less profit. Now again, it's bad. If there are powerful customers, that's a bad thing. But in many companies, there aren't powerful customers. And that's what we're going to use Porter's 5 forces for in the exam. We're going to say, actually, in this situation, customers aren't powerful. You don't have to worry about that one. But on the other hand, you do have to worry about new competition. Suppliers. Suppliers who are powerful will put their prices up. What will you do? Pay it, because they're powerful. You have no choice. So that's going to put your costs up, which again will reduce your profits. So the key thing with these first 4 of Porter's 5 forces, remember, is that they're all bad. The question in the exam, how bad are they in this case study, in this scenario? You may well get companies where the customers are not powerful. You may get scenarios where the suppliers are not powerful. Yep, so you'll need to think what's the most appropriate thing here. Now, you may remember that we said that one of the things we talked about in a previous lecture was we talked about culture. And I compared BPP and LSBF. And I said LSBF is very much a task culture. BPP is very much a role culture. In a role culture, you do what you're told. Task culture, you do what you think's best. Task cultures mean that you need people with experience. You need people with knowledge, because you're going to leave them to do what they think is best. That means they tend to be expensive. Now, LSBF is a task culture. Now, that means I am being paid to use my judgment, to use my knowledge, to use my experience to decide what is the best thing to do. Now, I know that LSBF want to use my knowledge, experience and judgment, so I expect them to pay me. So in LSBF, suppliers are very powerful. I get paid a good salary. So suppliers are very powerful, which pushes costs up. In BPP, because the lecturers are mainly just told what to do, they don't need a lot of experience. They don't need a lot of knowledge. They're much easier to replace. So in BPP, the suppliers are not powerful. That doesn't happen in BPP. But on the other hand, one of the things that BPP will have is it will have lots of corporate customers. Corporate customers, that they will train KPMG's ACCA students, or they'll train the BBC's ACCA students, or whoever it happens to be. And of course, those customers are very big. Those customers are very powerful. Those customers won't want to pay too much money. So that will reduce BPP's revenue. Now, we don't have any of them. We don't have corporate customers. So that doesn't affect us. So you remember when we did the macro environment, the economy affects everybody. Social, technological affects everybody. In the industry that we are in, there are some things that affect everybody. But the Porter's 5 forces analysis is very different. BPP have powerful customers. We don't. We have powerful suppliers. They don't. So it's different. And so what you'll have to do is you'll have to analyse the situation and say what's going on in this particular organisation. Now, I said to you earlier, how many forces are there? Importers, 5 forces. And I bet you all said 5. And there aren't. There are 7. Because this last one, substitutes, is broken down into 3 separate pieces. Now, I'll go through what those pieces are in a minute, but the key thing with substitutes are, if there are a lot of substitutes, you have less customers, your prices get forced down, your costs get forced up. So again, Porter is all about stuff which is bad. So maybe you will be able to say there is very little threat of substitutes in this industry. In a different industry, there's a big threat. So let's just have a look over the page at the substitutes, because there's 3 kinds of them. Direct, indirect, monetary. So we have competition new, competition existing, customers, suppliers, direct, indirect, monetary. We have 7 forces. Now, what does direct mean? You buy the same product from a different manufacturer. Indirect, you buy a product from a different industry. Monetary, you don't buy anything at all. Or you buy something that's completely different. Now, as an example, let's imagine that I'm going to travel from London, which I can't spell. Another go. I'm going to spell that London. London. I'm going to go from London to Paris. What I'm doing is I'm looking on BA's website. I'm looking on the website for British Airways, and I'm looking at their prices. Now, the thing is, if there are a lot of substitutes and you put your price up too high, if there's a lot of substitutes, people will just say, well, that's expensive, I'll go somewhere else. So you can't put your prices up too much if there's a lot of substitutes. So are there a lot of substitutes for British Airways flying from London to Paris? And notice I said flying from London to Paris. And the answer is yes. Air France, Lufthansa, KLM, there's loads of different airlines in Europe that fly from London to Paris. There's a lot of direct substitution. Lots of other airlines do the same journey. So if British Airways put their prices up too much, it's very easy for customers to just go somewhere else, which means they won't be able to put their prices up very much. They may even be forced to put their prices down if one of their rivals puts their prices down. Now that, remember, means they won't make much money. Now that's bad, but it gets worse. Because if I want to travel from London to Paris, I don't even have to fly. I could take the Eurostar, I could take the train, I could take the ferry. I could even drive the car through the Channel Tunnel. Which is, I have to be honest with you, the reason I'm using this example is my wife and I went to Paris last weekend and we drove. So you drive down to the port, they stick your car on a train, you drive off the other side. Now, again, what happens if British Airways put their prices up and so do all the other airlines? Well, I've still got a lot of choice because I've got other ways that I could get to France. So the thing is, the more substitutes there are, the worse it is, the bigger the threat. Because what happens if the train company, Eurostar is the train company, if they put their prices down, a lot of people say, well, I'll get the train then instead. Don't need to fly at all. It's actually easier for us, for my wife and I, it's actually easier for us to take the train than it is to fly. It's actually quicker. And driving isn't a lot slower. It's a lot cheaper though. So there are a lot of substitutes, which makes it very difficult for British Airways to put their prices up. Because if they put the prices up too much, everybody will just go. They'll just go somewhere else because there's lots of choice. Monetary substitute is where people say, you know what, I'm not going to travel to Paris at all. I'm going to spend the money on something else. So instead of spending the money going to Paris and having to pay for restaurants and hotel, I'm going to buy a new TV. Now, you notice it says it's competing for the same part of a customer's income. I don't have to go to Paris. I don't have to buy a new TV. We're talking about discretionary income. So there are lots of companies where they would like you to treat yourself to something. And they're all trying to get that bit of money that you use to treat yourself with. I think that there is an argument that you could argue that certainly, again, in places like the UK, I don't know where you are, but in places like the UK, coffee companies, people like Starbucks, they are trying to get they're trying to get a particular part of people's income, a treat that they have every day. Starbucks is expensive, I think. It's a cup of coffee. But that's just my opinion. But every time you go to Starbucks, there is something else that you don't buy. Or it might be you go to Starbucks every day and at the end of the month there's something that you can't afford to do. For all I know, Starbucks could be competing with cinemas. People think I can either spend £15 to go to the cinema on a Friday night, see a film, have some popcorn, blah, 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 or I could spend £3 a day for 5 days buying my cup of coffee. But I can't do both. I enjoy both, but I can't do both. Those would be monetary substitutes. The more monetary substitutes there are, the bigger the threat to the company, because people have got other things to do with their money. The more direct and indirect substitutes there are, the bigger the threat to the company, because people have got more things they could do with their money. So the idea then is that all of these 7 forces, you have to think about how big a deal they are in the exam. And some of them in the exam won't be important. In this particular question, customers aren't powerful, forget about them. But in this particular question, there's a lot of substitutes. The more things there are that are threats, the less attractive the industry is. Right? The less attractive the industry is. So, Porter's 5 forces. Again, the great thing from your point of view is the answer is going to be in the scenario. All you've got to do is say, why does it matter? So why is it important? Chapter 3 and Chapter 4 have been about the outside world. The rest of this session and the following one are about Chapter 5, the inside world, looking inside our organisation. Now again, we have got various different exam requirements. So for example, December 2014, look at the strengths and weaknesses of a particular company using value chain. June 2012, again, use the value chain. June 2011, look at some weaknesses. What would you do about them? So again, the answer is going to be in the scenario, just you're going to have to find it and you're going to have to talk about it. So June 2012, the question that's at the top of the page, you will have to know what the value chain is, and I will go through that. With you. Then you will have to say, in this case, this is what they're doing wrong. So it says, highlight areas of weakness. This is what they are doing wrong. Part B, what could they do to fix it? Interesting enough, and I'm not sure whether I've got it on here. No, I haven't. There we go. It's down at the bottom. December 2009, analyse the value chain. What is it they are doing? And then part B, what changes do they need to make? So these 2 questions, the Jane Cox Direct one, June 2012, and IL, Independent Living is the name of that company. It's the same question. Tell me what they're doing, tell me what's wrong in part A, tell me in part B, tell me how to fix it. Same model, same question, completely different answer, because it's a completely different scenario. Okay then, let's have a look at Chapter 5. Now, Chapter 5, internal analysis, is talking about what we're good at and what we're not so good at. In fact, I can saying we're good at something or not very good at is actually perhaps a little bit misleading. What we're looking at here is we're looking at strengths. And I said, we're looking at things that you're good at. And actually, I shouldn't have used that word. What I should have said, it's my fault, a strength is something that you are better at. You're better at than your rivals. That is going to give you a competitive advantage over your rivals. Very, very, very important. You may remember back in the definition in chapter 1 of what strategy was all about. Strategy is the direction and scope of the organisation, blah, 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 blah. One of the things we're trying to do is to gain an advantage. You gain an advantage by being better at something than your rivals. What is it that we're better at? That's what we're looking at in that's one of the things we're looking at in chapter 5. Now that's important because we might be able to do something, we might be able to follow a strategy where that advantage will help us in a new industry or in a new market. A very good example of that is Apple. Apple have got a number of strengths. One of them is they've got a very, very, very well-known brand name, and they've got a reputation for being very, very good at design. So, what have they done? What have they done recently? Well, they've launched a watch. It's got nothing to do with it's got nothing to do with the Macintosh computers they sell. It's got nothing to do with the iPads they sell. But it's a new industry. From a strategy point of view, it's a new industry they've gone into. But their strengths, their brand name and their design are going to help them in this new industry that they're going into. So they've found something where the same competitive advantage is going to give them, the same thing is going to give them a competitive advantage in the watch industry, the same way it does in the computer industry, the same way it does in the tablet PC industry. So strengths are things that you're better at. Can you use those to be better in another industry? That's a fairly common kind of exam question. And I'll be honest with you, in the exam, the answer is usually no. You're good at that, it will not help you if you try and do that. Because you're good at this thing, that thing's too different. So it would be like Apple are very good at, technology, etc. So will that give them a strength if they start making shampoo? I don't think so. Completely different kind of industry. So strengths. When we're looking at strengths, there are a number of different ways that we can look at strengths. One of them is what's called the 9Ms model. Now, the 9Ms model is exactly like PESTLE again. It's exactly like Porter's Five Forces. It's exactly like Porter's Five Forces again. It just gives you some headings. And all you're going to do is you're simply going to say, you told me this. It belongs under the heading of materials, but the important bit, this is why it's important to the company. This is why it matters. You told me this, it fits under machinery, and this is why it matters. This is why it matters. That's the key bit, all the time, over and over and over again. So, machinery. You might have an advantage over your rivals because you have got more up-to-date machinery. That allows you perhaps to do more things or perhaps to do them cheaper. You may remember when we had a look at the Hammond shoes question a few sessions ago, it said that their factory was about 20 years out of date. That would be one of the reasons why their shoes were a lot more expensive than other people's. So that was not a strength. Money. Access to finance. BPP is, I think, owned by a venture capital company. I believe it is. It used to be on the stock market. It used to be quoted on the London stock market. I could have bought shares in BPP a few years ago. But they're owned by a venture capitalist company, which means they have access to money. Kaplan is owned by an American company, which is owned by a company that's quoted on the New York Stock Exchange. They have got access to money. LSBF is a private company. I'm one of the shareholders. Now, what difference does that make? Let's imagine that all three of us want to follow a strategy of opening up colleges all over the world. It's going to take a lot of money. BPP can get the money. Kaplan can get the money. If LSBF come to me and say, David, we need $1 million to fund this, I'll say, well, I'll have a look down the back of the sofa. There's 20p. We don't have the same finance, so that's going to prevent us from doing certain things. Apple, who I've just mentioned, have got a pile of cash sitting on their balance sheet, sitting in a bank somewhere, that they could do something with. Access to money is a major competitive advantage. So again, you'll have to be told in the exam whether the company has access to the money or not. Materials. We could perhaps have access to certain raw materials that perhaps other companies do not. That could be giving us a competitive advantage. Now, I'll be honest, money comes up fairly regularly in the exam as a competitive advantage, or actually usually it's like the LSBF situation where it's a disadvantage. You get a lot of companies in the exam which are privately owned, have a lot of gearing. I don't think LSBF does, but have a lot of gearing, low liquidity, and they don't really have any money, so they can't do anything. So we've already seen that previously in other sessions. Men and women, this comes up a lot in the exam. The people that you employ have got skills. The people that you employ have got experience. They've got knowledge. That could be your competitive advantage. Now, I have said to you already that we've seen this in a couple of places already. As far as LSBF is concerned, we know that students come to LSBF because of the lectures. Students will do P3 because of me. Well, they might do. They'll do P2 because of Martin. They'll do P1 because of John. Me, maybe. But I know that that's true. I know that students come to the college because of the lecturers, which means we are powerful stakeholders. We saw that in chapter 2. It also means we are powerful suppliers of labour, Porter's 5 forces, that we saw a few minutes ago. That means, what do we want? We're employees. We want high wages. And because we're powerful, we get that. We get high wages. So you might say, but if you're so expensive, because I am expensive, you can't afford me. But if you're expensive, why doesn't the company get rid of you then? By getting cheaper lecturers. Because we bring in more revenue than we cost. So the skills and experience are a competitive advantage for LSBF, but you're going to have to pay for it. So that's probably one of the biggest, I would say that's the biggest competitive advantage that LSBF have. It's the lecturing staff. The culture could be a competitive advantage. Now, we talked, if you remember, back in chapter 2 about the cultural web. And normally in the exam, the culture is something that's going to cause you problems. The culture you've got is not appropriate. But it could be something that is allowing you to do things in a very good way. I think KPMG's culture is very good for what KPMG do. Doesn't suit me, but it's very good for what they're trying to do. It is definitely a competitive advantage that they have. You could be like Apple, and you could just have products in the right industries. Apple have been very, I was going to say lucky, and I don't think it is lucky, but they have been very successful in the last few years because they've been in the right industries. The iPod, when MP3 players were growing, the iPhone, the rise of mobile phones, the iPad, they happen to be in 3 very, very, very fast-growing industries fairly near the beginning. And so because of that, they've grown along with those industries. If they were a steel company, where that industry is declining, they wouldn't be doing nearly as well. So maybe one of the reasons that you're successful is because of the industries you're in. You're in industries that are growing. Management and management information, to a certain extent, sort of say, maybe you're successful because of the managers you have. Now, I mentioned earlier in this lecture, when we were talking about strategic groups, talked a little bit about the English Premier League and football. And as I said, I don't really know very much about football, but I do know that managers of football teams get paid a lot of money. Why? They never kick a football. They're not on the field. but they can be a major competitive advantage to a team, which is why they also get paid a lot of money for doing things. So maybe you are successful because of the manager that you have. Maybe you are successful because the manager is able to make good decisions. That may be because they've got a lot of skills and experience, but it also could be because they have good information. Now, if any of you are doing or are going to be doing P5, a lot of P5 is about management information. It's about what information do you need to give the people at the top so that they can make the right decisions. And if they don't have that information, you won't do very well. Maybe the reason why you're successful is you're giving people the numbers, the information that they need to make good decisions. And the final one of the 9 M's is something that we're actually going to see in chapter 11 and 12. Processes, the way that you do things. The way that you do things. Not what you have, materials you have, money you have, manpower you have. It's what you do with them. Now, that's a big thing in chapter 11 and chapter 12. Now, the final thing that I'm just going to mention for the moment is what are called thresholds. A threshold is a minimum that people expect. So it's a minimum that people expect. One of the problems that we often get in an exam question is a company which is upsetting customers, because customers are saying, look, we're paying you the money and we're not getting what we expect from you. And that is a weakness that needs to be fixed. So we've been talking about strengths that give you competitive advantages. A weakness could be this threshold. And the threshold is the minimum that people expect. And if you do not meet that, you will lose customers. Customers will say, I don't care about your product. I don't care it's a brand name. The product doesn't work. Or I don't care that it looks nice. The battery only lasts for 20 minutes. I don't care about all the good bits. I notice the bad bit. You need to fix those as quickly as you can. And, as it says in the notes, a lot of the second half of the course, chapter 11, chapter 12, to a certain extent chapter 13 and chapter 14, are talking about fixing things which are going wrong before they get too bad. So, when we're talking about chapter 5, when we're talking about internal analysis, when we're talking about strengths, we're talking about things which give you a competitive advantage, but we can also be talking about things that we have to do correctly because otherwise we're going to upset our customers. Okay then, final thing just to remind you, this could count as the numbers, particularly non-financial stuff. So things like age of machinery, things like customer complaints, things like time taken to process orders, these often in the exam indicate some kind of weakness. Particularly if you are given things like the industry average. You can benchmark us against the average and our numbers are worse. That means we've got a problem and that problem needs fixing before we do anything else. Okay then, now what we will do then is again we will take a break there. When we come back with this session, whenever you get round to looking at it, we will finish talking about chapter 5. We'll finish looking, the big model we're going to look at is Porter's value chain. That'll be coming up a bit later on. And we will also have a look at a question from June 2013, I think it was, Machine Shop, which is looking at all this kind of analysis stuff and seeing how it all fits together. So until you get a chance to come back, good luck with all your studies.